I'm going to open up with a question, though, first to Carrie Adams, who's the CEO of the Union for International Cancer Control and also chair of the NCD Alliance, having moved from the banking sector to focus on these particular healthcare issues. He and his team focus on global advocacy to deliver World Cancer Declaration targets by 2020. So I want to thank you very much, Kerry, for this, and ask you first, what sort of shift are you seeing indicating that organizations are recognizing there's a greater need for collaboration and partnerships in order to have a greater impact, to achieve more?
Well, I think you mentioned I'm chair of the NCD Alliance, and I actually put that on the table as a great example of partnership and innovation, which was born out of need, because 3-4 years ago, certainly the NGO sector wasn't collaborating around the issue of NCDs. In fact, most people didn't know what an NCD was. I mean, no one goes to a doctor and says, hey, I've got an NCD. I represent the cancer people. There's diabetes, there's heart, and there's lung. And 3.5 years ago, some bright spark had the idea that those 4 federations, the biggest federations for those diseases, should get together. And I wish I found that man, because I could kill him too, because running any alliance is incredibly difficult. But the thing that holds Joanna Ralston, who's here, and Anne Keeling and Niels Bilo and myself together on the NCD Alliance is that we have a common cause. We have common areas, we have risk factors in common, we have palliation in common, we have the improvements in primary care in common. And our boards, I must take my hat off to our boards, certainly said that this is a way forward which we feel apprehensive about, but we can see that in the long term, working together collaboratively and in an innovative way as well, is probably the best way that we can change the way that NCDs, this non-thing that we keep describing, can be addressed globally. And I think I would put that on the table as a fantastic example of collaborating on common issues, on common ground, and to some extent, not ignoring the differences, but accepting the differences and allowing each federation to pursue their own disease-specific activities, but getting together in that common space.
I'm going to touch on some of the points you've raised there, Kerry, as we get going in the debate as well. And again, I encourage you to pick up on anything that's said as well. But let me bring in Nigel Darby here, who's Vice President of Biotechnologies at GE Healthcare and Life Sciences, where innovation and investment are actually very much in the sector, in the multi-billion-dollar plus commitment. We're sure to have an interesting perspective on that. And Nigel, if I could start asking you what contribution you see diagnostics making to healthcare in future?
Yeah, thanks, Riz. So, I mean, that's a very long question. We could spend all day debating that. But if we just take a quick overview, I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, if we're thinking about driving healthcare efficiency, without a doubt, the earlier you can identify and characterize a disease, the earlier the intervention, the less cost is likely to be generated within the healthcare system. So going forward, we see probably a change in balance between the amount that we spend in diagnostics and the amount that we spend on therapeutics, with perhaps going more towards the diagnostic part of the equation, because that undoubtedly drives some efficiencies in the healthcare system. I think, secondly, there are some diseases that without good diagnostic paradigms are practically impossible to treat. I think one great example is Alzheimer's disease, where we know that without a good early diagnostic, it's going to be practically impossible to treat that disease. And so, I know that many people in the room are very engaged working with the challenges of Alzheimer's, very difficult disease to work with. But as we're evolving an understanding of how Alzheimer's occurs at the molecular level, we start to understand the pathology, ways of diagnosing. We can couple that with the treatment opportunities and really figure out the best way and the best stage in the disease to intervene. Then I think that the third aspect, which was highlighted a little bit in the short video at the start, was as we start to understand more about the molecular basis of disease, our abilities to tailor treatments to individual patients start to become much greater. If we had sat in this room 15 years ago and talked about personalized medicine, I think a lot of us would have, well, it's a little bit science fiction. But as we get to first decade of the 2000s, I think we've already seen over the last 5 years quite a significant number of instances where we couple diagnostics to therapeutics, particularly in the cancer area, where we have some very good molecular tests that allow us to really identify patients which will benefit most from some specific treatment. And that's actually a big deal both for the patient, so that you don't put in place inappropriate treatments, but from a payer perspective, the fact that you can target medicines towards individuals who will benefit from those medicines really drives some quite significant efficiencies in the healthcare system. So, you know, from the business that I come from, we're very much focused towards diagnostics. We see it as a partnership with therapeutics and really a way to make sure that the therapeutics going forward are used in the very best possible way.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Again, to get the perspective of the panelists, I'm just going to kick off with a question to each. So I'll bring in now Dr. David Khayat, who's head of medical oncology at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, where he developed a research lab working on both tumor immunology and on the pharmacokinetics of anti-cancer drugs. The professor has been leading a global voice in the battle against cancer, and we're glad to have you here, sir. I need to ask you, I guess, to start with, why is it important to make people aware that serious diseases are as much a political problem as much as a medical and scientific one? Why is it that that's an important thing for people to realize?
Well, actually, it does not appear very obvious that it is a political issue, but it is a political issue when such a disease affects that many people. I mean, you have to understand that according to WHO, in the year 2020, there will be 20 million new cases of cancer over the world, killing about 10 million people that year. Cancer affects, in Europe, 1 man out of 2 and 1 woman out of 3. Cancer kills more people in the world every year than altogether malaria, tuberculosis, and AIDS. So when you declaring war against this disease is a political matter, and this is the only way to put all together, all the army, all the soldiers, all the resources. If any one of us, the pharmaceutical industry, the government, the NGOs, the doctors, and everything are working not together, we won't be able to defeat such a very complex disease, a very costly disease. When it comes to a disease that costs so much money to our nations every year, and when there is such a discrepancy between the needs in terms of human resources, doctors, nurses, people that have skills, that have the necessary skills to treat patients with cancer or make the diagnosis of cancer and so on, in many parts of the world, and not only in the very poor world, we are dealing with a political matter, and it is very important to convince our governments that cancer is a political issue. That's what we have done in Europe with the UNESCO Charter Against Cancer that have been signed by the General Director of UNESCO in 2000 on the 4th of February, and Jacques Chirac was President of France, making the 4th of February the World Cancer Day. And since then, every year, I mean, 4th of February is a day where we at least once a year, we think at cancer as a political issue. And this is the way we think we can put all together all the forces and try to be stronger by being together to try to defeat cancer.
And Professor, I'll get back to you on some of the results you've been seeing with your work just a little later in the panel as well. But let me bring in Dr. John Leclair, who's Chairman, President, and CEO of Eli Lilly. They really get their money's worth from you, all three of those. We're very honored to have you with us as well, sir, and congratulations on your new position. Now, there are some clear gaps in the system. So I'd like to get your assessment. Diabetes may have a fair amount of research taking place, for example. But what about the need for innovations in delivery systems? And perhaps the need to update the medicines themselves. Where do things stand on that front?
I think we've said for a long time that the medicines in terms of preventing and treating disease are often necessary but seldom sufficient. So Lilly's been, for example, in the diabetes business with the making insulin available back in 1923. But if you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes today, you may require insulin, but that's just the beginning of what you're really going to need in order to have good health today and to avoid terrible consequences down the road. So I think one thing that we collectively need to innovate around are the services, the information, the infrastructure in some cases that are necessary to ensure that ultimately the patients get to good health. I mean, if any of us have ever fought disease, or if we've had family members who are fighting disease, we're interested in the care, the points of care, the medicines, but we really want the person we want wellness, we want health. So I think we've got to have that outcome in mind. It's making a medicine available may be a good start, but we need to think about all the other things that go into that. And we need to also think, frankly, about adherence to medicines. I know a lot of data from the US. I doubt the data is much different around the world, but many, many people never fill a prescription to begin with. Many people who are on chronic medications, which typically are required to treat non-communicable diseases, will take their medicine for a month or two, and they don't feel bad, so they'll stop taking the medicine. So I think this is a much more complex sort of social set of issues as well as medical issues that we need to address. And I think it's very much in keeping with our theme today of innovation. We need to innovate not only the medicines themselves, but everything else around it.
Thank you, sir. Of course, more points raised there for us to discuss as we go on. Mary Lou Valdez is Associate Commissioner for International Programs at the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, so I hope we have your approval. Those two words always go together, I don't know why. The Office of International Programs leads the FDA's global efforts, and Lou Valdez manages 100+ staff across the world in an effort to boost collaboration and cooperation with the public and private sectors. And that's what I wanted to ask you to start with, is what is the FDA doing to innovate, to put itself in a position of setting global standards?
Well, all of you know the Food and Drug Administration extremely well, and kind of from our 1906 beginning, where we've had a very significant domestic focus, it's been clear to us, particularly post-heparin, post-melamine, and other events, that we can no longer have that domestic focus and really need to look much more broadly, much more upstream, with an increasing reliance on a number of partners, including our regulatory authority partners around the globe. It's one of the reasons we had made the decision to strategically place foreign post, and so we now have a toehold in every continent in the globe, albeit small and nascent. We are also, we have a pathway report that the commissioner put out in 2011, and in that it really speaks to 4 key recommendations that will help us kind of move from that domestic focus to really a global public health agency of the 21st century. And those include increasing or the establishment of global coalitions, and those can take on a whole host of characteristics, both public and private, but really trying to recognize that we cannot do it alone. We really must work together. And as has been said earlier, what is that new type of leadership that will be required to ensure the safety and quality of products? So global coalitions, better data and information systems, and a way to better align those. A third is increasing our strength in risk analytics. We have a lot of data, but what is the data really telling us, and how do we begin to pull out common threads that will help us recognize early and much more routinely what may be emerging trends, what may be emerging challenges, and to deal with those much more quickly. And then the fourth pillar, fourth recommendation, is really an increasing reliance on third party, both public and private sector. Again, we cannot work in isolation. It is simply too large. If you look at the FDA's current landscape, we get 300,000 manufacturing facilities from 150 countries through 130,000 importers. It is a vast array of products that we regulate, as you know, and we need to step back and say how in this increasingly complex world and increasingly complex supply chain, we recognize that there are weak links, and we have to work collectively to really address those. So I think there's a whole host of things like that we're doing and thinking through to really move that global paradigm shift.
Let me do a quick follow-up here with you, Lou, please. And you mentioned these 4 points, but what do you see as the biggest challenge in securing the FDA as a global agency to get that kind of position?
I think it's actually ourselves trying to change that cultural paradigm for us to recognize that indeed globalization affects everything that we do, and how do we as a regulatory agency kind of work within this new increasingly complex paradigm which is called globalization, and recognizing that so many of our products now come from outside the United States, or at least a critical portion thereof. And so it really is forcing us to look much more globally at supply chains, where is data coming from? How do we really align better efforts so that we can kind of expand the global safety net?
Thank you very much, Lou Valdez. So ladies and gentlemen, let me open it up to you here. You've heard 5 interesting perspectives on this theme of treading new ground to meet global health needs. Everything from collaborations and partnerships to the issue of personalized medicine becoming a greater focus, the issue of issues of cancer and other diseases becoming a political concern. Of course, setting global standards there, as Lou Valdez said. And of course, as Dr. Lechleiter said, the balance between delivery systems and innovating new drugs. So let's open it up and get your perspectives. You all have a vested interest in being here. So if you put your hands up, we'll get microphones to you. Just let us know who you are, where you're from, and we'll get your questions and comments in as well. Now, as I wait for the hands to go up, I'm going to turn back to Carrie Adams here and ask about the impact of partnerships. You mentioned earlier on collaborations and partnerships, and I wonder what impact are you seeing these collaborations and partnerships having on low and middle income countries?
Well, quite a significant impact at the moment. I mean, the NGO sector has been working, across the low income countries for many years, and I think what we're seeing is collaboration at different levels, not just in low middle income countries, but particularly in those areas. That's where the problem is. Just hearing the discussion there. What we have in low middle income countries, the average spend on health per person per annum is about less than $25 a year, which in my money is 2.5 beers in Geneva, which is not a lot of money, John. So the profit pools are quite small there. So to be fair, to drag people into that space to say let's solve the problem I think has been a real challenge for people. And what the NGO sector has obviously done in those environments is done the best it can in the difficult circumstances it's found. And I will applaud a lot of the organisations in this room who have certainly committed to work in those environments to deliver cheaper drugs, to do training and education. Roche runs a train which runs around South Africa giving complete health support to a whole host of communities. There are great examples of where it works. But I fear, and this is a personal fear, that it's just not enough. It's just not enough. We've got to lift it, because if we look at the figures from WHO, we have an NCD burden which is growing rapidly. So 80% of all deaths are in low middle income countries. The growth is in those countries. That's where the growth is going to be in the next 20 years. And it demands a completely different solution set and paradigm on how we go in there. And I think one of the things that we need to think about is to perhaps pull away from this individual company with NGO demonstration project in target countries which satisfies some sort of political issue, to pull away and say as an industry, how can we solve this so we can make some big changes rather rapidly across large tranches of countries? That's what I would take.
So a quick follow-up then, is there any sense of moving away from competition and collaboration being a good way to do good business, so to speak? Is there a better sense of understanding that?
I think there is. I think the NCD debate at the global level has allowed us to recognise that there's personalised medicines and things like that. Absolutely, there's a market for that. But as a generation, and I've got 2 kids, and if I look at them, they're lucky. They're born and they grow up in the UK, and hopefully nothing will ever happen. But the health service is there to protect them if there is a problem, and me, hopefully. But I think as our generation, we now have enough information to say we have, for whatever reason, created an incredible time bomb, a problem, a tsunami of NCDs, which Sir George described last night, which I think our generation has to step up and resolve. And we're looking for leadership from the UN, the WHO, but on their own, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's really not going to happen. It's got to be the 3 components. It's got to be what the NCD Alliance we call the 3 Ps. It's got to be public, private, and people. Civil society working together in a whole range of different ways across large areas of the globe to resolve problems that, to some extent, the Western world has delivered into those environments.
Thank you. It was worrying, actually, Sir George saying last night it was like, I think, a $41 trillion cost burden for NCDs as well. We had a couple of hands go up. This gentleman first, then to you, sir. So this gentleman first here. Please tell us who you are and where you're from, and keep your interventions concise, please, sir.
Good morning. My name is Tapan Ray, and I'm from India. My question to the panel is, what sort of innovation you think will be necessary today to improve access of innovative medicines to the people of developing countries of the world?
Okay. Dr. Lechleiter, I'm going to put this to you first, if I may, sir. The developing world and its needs, and what innovations are needed to deliver the right kind of needs they have.
A couple of thoughts that I would have. I think that building on what Kerry said, we need to encourage partnerships, because this is the only way that this will happen, through partnerships, to do more capacity building kinds of work to make the system function well. Going back to what I said earlier, I think all of us sort of have this picture of medicines getting to patients, but we know that's a very complex process, and we know that seldom works well unless it's within the context of a system that is fairly robust. What can our industry do, I would ask, since to bring the question back to us, to help build the sort of capacity that's necessary to ensure that whether it's in India or any other country around the world, we have the kind of system in place in most cases that would support the delivery of health care or the delivery of medicines. One idea would be, for example, in our industry, our factories have to operate to very high standards, good manufacturing practices. I know some companies have, in the pharma industry, have done work with local companies to ensure that medicines that are made locally, generic medicines, for example, are made according to the principles of good manufacturing practices. That's knowledge transfer, where we have the knowledge and we can be of assistance in building capacity. The other thing I would say is, and this could be a subject we spend a day on in and of itself, I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that intellectual property is somehow incompatible with access. I think we have to figure out how to have both. Innovation in our space is never going to happen without the promise of intellectual property protection, and yet I don't think we need to say that somehow mitigates against access in the broadest sense of the word.
Actually, the IP issue is coming up later in the discussion today as well, so that'll be interesting to hear as well. Lou Valdez, on this subject, one of the issues here, of course, is the developing world, the growing needs of the developing world in emerging markets is high standards. They want to have what the developed world has had. So how do you set those standards and make sure that they have the same level and commitment that the developed world has had?
Because the source of so many of our products nowadays come from developing countries, or at least they're a critical part of the supply chain system, we are very interested in working with governments in developing countries, including China and India, to really, as John said, how do we begin to position regulatory systems, not as in strong regulatory standards, not as an impediment to innovation or impediment to good business, but rather as an essential imperative to both strong public health outcomes, increasing economic development, and increasing access to export markets. There's got to be a way that we begin to embrace a much more kind of comprehensive, holistic paradigm to the delivery of care, but using the regulatory infrastructure as that essential backbone. And so good GNP, working both with regulators, industry, academia, and we recently had an Institute of Medicine report to look at the essential elements of regulatory systems within a developing country context. India was one of the countries studied by the IOM, and there are a whole host of recommendations, but one of which is the lack of professionalization of regulators around the globe, and that lack of a real esprit de corps among regulators. So is there a way that we can work collectively to begin to build that baseline kind of a global curriculum and essential standards? We have worked very long and hard on ICH standards, and yet the gap between standards development and standards implementation still remains a challenge for all of us. But we need to look at these things as collective challenges.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to add your voice to the discussion too. Sir, you are next.
Thank you very much. My name is Norman Sartorius. I'm here from Geneva. I wanted to ask two questions. The one is, I think the sad fact that the fifth large contributor to disability and morbidity, that is the mental and neurological disorders, have not been included among the four great ones that Dr. Adams has spoken about. They are not only producing disability and problems on their own, but they also make the treatment of these other conditions much more difficult. Depression with diabetes or cancer with another mental illness will probably be more difficult to handle. My second question concerns the fact that these four alliances, four members of the alliance, as well as in general what we are doing in industry and elsewhere, is dealing with individual diseases. But the world deals with comorbidity. 60% of all people have more than one illness at the same time. And we are truly ignorant about the way in which we should deal with this. How do you best rate somebody who has cancer, depression, and a cardiovascular illness, and who should bring these people together to do it? That's an interesting question practically, but it's also an interesting question for research development. Today we know that inflammatory processes are equally important in depression and in diabetes. Perhaps that would open new vistas for research and also for treatment.
Very relevant point, sir. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to actually put the second part of your question, the second question, to Nigel Darby here and talk about this from a personalized medicine perspective that you raised initially. A very important point. It's not treating these diseases as individual. It does create its own problems when trying to find treatments. How can there be a more holistic approach?
You know, that's a very tough question in many respects, but probably, you know, the answer really starts from the perspective of understanding disease in the clearest and most detailed way. I think we're starting to get a range of technologies, and these have been coming on over the last 10, 15 years as we've understood more, for example, about the genome and how, you know, the molecular basis of disease. We're starting to understand better how we can interpret disease at a molecular level. And so when we think about some of the key processes that you mentioned, such as inflammation, we do now start to get some very good tools to look at inflammation, whether we're talking about inflammation in the brain or in the rest of the body. We think particularly about in vivo imaging tools, which can give a very good handle on inflammation. Other biomarkers which relate to inflammatory processes, blood-borne biomarkers. I think we're actually just at the very start of this. And at the moment, where we see you know, some clear wins are in relatively limited areas where we have single biomarkers against a particular disease. But going forward, I think we're starting to get a range of tools that will allow us to interpret multiple biomarkers and relate those multiple biomarkers to appropriate treatments and really figure out what the likely outcome with the patient is. So I think we're really at the very start of that process at the moment, and it's remarkable how quickly things are moving. And again, as I said, you know, if we go back 5, 10 years ago, when we thought about personalized medicine, even when we thought about using biomarkers, there was a lot of skepticism. But the more we see those applied into clinical medicine, clinical trials, the better we are at understanding how we can relate the molecular basis of a disease really to its treatment. And so, you know, I think we have to be kind of optimistic. We're not there yet, but the next 5 years, if the next 5 years the pace of understanding disease is as rapid as the last 5 years, then I think we'll start to be able to address some of the challenges that we're putting forward.
And Professor Khayat, the issue of mental health also comes into treatment, for example, with cancer. And I want to maybe get a perspective on the first question from the work you have done and how perhaps having to look at a disease such as cancer from different angles, taking into account the mental health component too, and then we can look at mental health a little more broadly. But give us some idea of what the work you've done.
Okay. Well, it's true that mental illness are going to make the treatment and the management of cancer more complex, but it's a huge issue, and I don't think we can address that within a short time that we have. No, I think that what you want me to explain is what we have done. At the time, Jacques Chirac asked me to launch a national cancer plan in France and to set up the National Cancer Institute. We have started to work with a great team, putting all the forces together in France against this disease, working on epidemiology, on screening, on prevention, on diagnosis, on research, on social issues and everything. But at some point, after a few months of work, it was obvious that the parliament, I mean the political people, were starting to raise questions about do we really need to address the issue of cancer on that way, with investing so much money on that, and I had to go to the parliament on a regular basis for hearings. And I found out, I was quite naive, I think, I found out that explaining cancer to these people on the way I was looking at it as an oncologist, I mean, talking about people that are dying, talking about sufferance, talking about shaped destinies and emptiness and death and all that, was not really the way I could address the question so that they could really understand what cancer was at the political level in a country such as France. So what we've done is that we've set up the economical cancer committee, taking all together the 15 more important health economists in France. And the question I asked them to work on and write a report was how much cancer costs to France. So all the figures I'm going to give you are figures for 2004 and 2005, but I mean, it's about the same today. So when you look at the cost of cancer, you have to look at the direct cost of cancer, which is the cost of hospitals, drugs, doctors, ambulance, and everything. And this came up to about 10 billion euros per year. That you have to know that that same year, the parliament voted the healthcare expenses for the nation for the year, and this was 140 billion euros. So the direct cost of cancer altogether, private, public sectors and everything, was about 10 billion. So less than about 6% of the total cost of healthcare. When you add the indirect cost of cancer, which is how much it costs to the nation, that the fact that people are dying prematurely, and cancer is the first cause, by far, the first cause of premature death in France, mainly because of lung cancer, because of tobacco. And when you calculate how much it costs, and it costs not only up to 65, but it costs even later up to the life expectancy, because if you are 75 and you are not working anymore and not apparently producing any GDP, when you keep at home the babies of your son or daughter, you are doing a work that has a commercial value, because if you were not there, if you were dead, then they had to take a babysitter, and the babysitter would have cost something. So you can calculate that, up to 65 and up to the life expectancy. And the indirect cost of cancer, which is the cost, how much it costs not being able to cure cancer, because you die of this disease, is 17 billion euros, so much more than the direct cost of cancer. Altogether, cancer is about, therefore, 27, 28 billion. And so when I came up with these figures, with these numbers, the parliament, I mean, the people were asking me, yes, but, you said that we spend 10 billion and we should spend more money for that disease because you explain us that if a patient dies, this is what costs the most, not the fact that we have treated him. And, but, it's very expensive to treat cancer. And I asked so I had to convince them that was not true. So I asked the Social Security, which is an independent body in France, to calculate how much it costs per capita and per year to treat a cancer patient compared to the management of all the main other very chronic and heavy diseases such as graft, dialysis, AIDS, and everything. And on the average, and these are numbers raised by the Social Security Organization, is about 8,000 euros per year per capita for each, on an average, for these 30 big diseases. When you look at cancer specifically, it's 7,900 euros. So when you say it's expensive to treat a cancer patient, that's absolutely not true. It's just because you think that it's expensive, because you think it's not worth to treat a cancer patient. Then I came up with these numbers, and they say, yeah, but I understand it's on the average, but the drugs are very expensive in cancer. So again, I went back to the Social Security and said, can you calculate how much it costs in terms of drugs out of these 8,000 euros per capita and per year for the 30 big diseases that we have to treat? And on the average, out of the national expenses for healthcare, medicines are about 20%. Now, for these 30 big diseases, on the average is 19.5%. So it's on the average. And when you look at cancer specifically, is 20%. So again, it's just the image that the political people have about the drugs of cancer, about the treatment of cancer, and about the fact that it's normal to die from cancer. That's finally the conclusion. And I had to explain them that's absolutely not true. Cancer drugs are not that expensive. They're on the average of how much drugs cost to treat or to keep alive a patient with dialysis, we said, whatever. And that on the average, the management of a cancer patient is not more expensive. And that what costs the most is not to treat patient, but to let patient die.
Right. So it's interesting here, you've got the sort of convergence of both political lack of will and society's misperceptions of what cancer is as well, which is interesting. Dr. Lechleiter, I want to touch on the issue of mental health again also, because I was in Rio when NCDs were being discussed, and mental health was kind of a last-minute throw-in. And this touches on what our participant was mentioning in his question, the fact that it's still an area that's being explored and hasn't been fully addressed. And I wonder, from your perspective, how much of a greater importance needs to be put on the issue of mental health and the way it's treated?
Well, we've grouped, we put a cluster of different disease groups under this heading of NCDs. We could also have described this as chronic disease to some extent. In my view, there's no question that mental illness fits under this NCD rubric. And I think the prevalence of mental illness, whether that's depression or schizophrenia or other disorders, is now well established, and it's quite extensive. I think that in simplistic terms, heart disease is a disease that affects the heart and the organs around the heart. We think of pulmonary disease or respiratory disease, and we think of the lungs. Mental illness is a disease of the brain, and we have more trouble understanding, I think, how the brain works because it's a bit less penetrable than these other organs. So I think Norman Sartorius, who asked the question, makes a very, very good point. And I think we certainly add to the complexity when we start looking at comorbidities and we start looking at these diseases in combination. But I think we do have to keep in mind that we're really not treating diseases, we're treating people. And we tend to be a bit more complex in most cases than we might tend to intimate in the way we describe it. So it is a second-order complexity that I think we have to consider.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do encourage you to take part in the discussion while we have still about 15 minutes left of this debate, so put your hands up, we'll get a microphone to you there, sir. But Carrie Adams, you wanted to add something to this.
Yeah, I did. I think this is a classic example where the political agenda has actually set the tone of the discussion that's taken place. I mean, the NCD Alliance was formed because the WHO definition of NCDs were the 4 disease groups and the 4 risk factors, and it seemed quite logical that those 4 groups should get together, therefore to work in that space to argue the case for those 4 diseases and those 4 risk factors. But the NCD Alliance has been fully aware that the mental health is a fundamental issue that we all face, and you mentioned comorbidity, absolutely. I mean, I attend palliative care wards, and you look at the doctors do the review of each of the patients there in the last few weeks of their life, and it's like pick 10 from 16 illnesses that they have, including heart, diabetes, cancer, secondary. It's all there. Now, from the NCD Alliance perspective, we're just about to conduct a search to find a global mental health federation that we would like to come and join us on our steering group, because we believe that we should lead the way on this discussion now, that it cannot be ignored. Things get muddled a lot. I mean, you mentioned the $47 trillion. That actually includes the loss in GDP over the next 2 decades from mental health and the other NCDs. So occasionally it works in our favor, actually, that number's quoted, but it does include mental health. So I think you're right to raise that point. I think that we're getting to a situation now where certainly the Alliance wishes to bring mental health in, and I'm hopeful that the dialogue that takes place at the UN and WHO, and particularly in the MDG replacements post-2015, I'm hopeful that mental health will come into that discussion.
Thank you, sir. Question there, please. Sorry. Everyone's awake now. Yes, try again, sorry. A little closer to you, sorry. I don't know what's happening. Have we got that microphone up? Try again. Maybe we can get the other microphone to you. We want to hear what you have to say, so let's not battle with technology.
My name is Luc Besançon. I'm working for the World Pharmacist Association. While we often discuss about the access to medicines, we also sometimes try to forget all the aspect of responsible use of medicines. And for instance, at our last Congress, we have a report that's estimated that about $500 billion could be saved every year by solving the irresponsible use of medicines, which include adherence, which include polymedication elements. And I would like maybe to ask the panelists what kind of innovation they see and what their roles would be in innovating in this specific field of responsible use of medicines, or more precisely, irresponsible use of medicine.
Thank you very much. And Lou Valdez, I could touch on this perhaps. Is it simply a case of regulating for better use of medicines?
It's not only regulating, because I think you can really have good pharmacovigilance systems in place that will help us kind of get our arms around adverse events. But we need to recognize that PV systems globally are really very scant today. So that would be one area in which to do it. But I also think it's that area where partnership could really come into play. Because I do think it's not, as part of the global community, we have focused on the need for access to medicines, and we now really do need to couple that with the responsible use, rational use of medicines, and then you kind of backing that up with data so that decisions can continue to be made within more of an evidence-based context.
Nigel Darby, is the innovation of medicine, the innovative creation of new medicines, going to help in this issue?
I think one of the principal things that we can do going forward to ensure more responsible use of medicines, clearly the way in which we manage information around patients is a big challenge. So, ability to be able to track patients, understand what medications they're taking, that they're complying with medication regimes, and also that when we do get adverse events, we can get very rapid feedback and data back to regulators. Because, often we see sporadic adverse events around the world which on an individual basis are maybe not significant. But if you can assemble that data from around the world, that starts to be a very powerful tool. So I think one of the things that we constantly hope for is really innovation in healthcare IT, the ability to mine data from patient communities, and also the ability to make sure that even patients under our control are taking the right kind of medications, prescribing is appropriate, and that there's good compliance to medication regimes. It's a little bit sad to me that given the sophistication of the IT technology that we have today, we've not completely cracked yet the contribution of IT in the healthcare environment. I know our businesses, as others in the room will be, striving towards making sure that we can get some of that progress put in place. But that strikes me as being, if we can get the technology in place, a very, very straightforward win without the need to develop lots of new medicines.
Professor Khayat, perhaps I can touch on this from the perspective of cancer and your work, that I wonder how much innovation is going to help make more efficient use of drugs and treatments. And of course, as you said, the perceptions are wrong when it comes to cancer, but how much more could you see innovation advancing your work in the near future?
Well, I think cancer is most probably at the top level regarding the need for innovation, because it's really still an unmet need. I mean, there's so many patients dying for the disease. And we are looking at a complete shift on the way we are treating cancer patients. I mean, we had treatments that were developed and prescribed for a given type of cancer. So we were treating all breast cancer the same way, all lung cancer the same way, and so on. Toward today, really a very much personalized medicine and using targeted therapy. So first, which is intelligent medicine, because we first find out what is the molecular basis of what happened into a cancer cell to make that cancer cell such a threat. And then we set up drugs that can directly find out the cells, and uniquely the cells that are carrying that mutation or that specific property, that specific protein, and then kill that cells or block that process. So we move from how to treat. Today it happened that we treat breast cancer not using drugs for breast cancer, but using drugs for lung cancer or for melanoma, just because being able to do genomic evaluation, genomic portrait of the tumor for that given patient, we can find out that surprisingly, that cancer patient having a breast cancer is carrying a mutation that usually is being found on a melanoma patient. And having a specific targeted therapy on that melanoma target, we can use that drug for breast cancer and we can save that patient. I mean, I had a patient a few months ago to whom it happened exactly that way. So we moved toward personalized medicine, personalized molecular diagnosis, and personalized targeted therapy. So we need innovation, and we are having new drugs, not only new drugs, but new concept on how to develop fine drugs. Now, to answer the question, I think not only regulatory can regulate the issue of responsible use of drug, but also, and I think this is a key issue, is education, medical education, both initial and continuing medical education. Having a doctor who knows how to use drug is very important to be sure that the drugs are going to be used on the best way.
Yeah. In the past hour, we've raised a number of points and issues when it comes to the challenges facing innovation, and I want to actually here at this point bring in a perspective that was recorded on video earlier on the issue of what others can do to address challenges. We will hear now from Dr. Hong Thi Pham, the Managing Director of Bionet Asia, a biotech company based in Thailand, specializing in the development and marketing of vaccines in emerging markets. And this is what he had to say on the issue of what can be done, what others can do to address the challenges the industry faces.
Governments can definitely contribute in shaping the development of new medicines, which does not mean only developing medicine by public entities, but also finding innovative ways to fund and build development capabilities. National priorities usually focus on the academic research, where they should move one step forward in supporting process and clinical development. Biotech companies in the emerging markets should also have access to international funds, because they will address local health needs using local resources and capabilities.
That was coming in from Dr. Hong Thi Pham of Bionet Asia. I wanted just with a minute for each panelist in the last 5 minutes to get a sum up of where you see innovation taking your particular field of work and how it might impact your work in perhaps the next 5 to 10 years. Carrie Adams, start with you. What major innovation do you think is going to change what you do?
Well, our focus is addressing what the problem is today, and predominantly across low middle income countries. So I absolutely love the idea that we have more investment in personalized medicines, but the innovation we need is how do we get the generics and the medicines we have today into the hands of those who unfortunately do not have the ability to get hold of them. And I always use the issue of just a simple drug. Now, morphine. Morphine is cheap. It's readily available. 70% of it is used in 5 countries. Most of low-income countries, you die in excruciating pain. That's it, full stop. Untreated. In fact, many cancer patients are asked to leave the hospital because they're too noisy. Now, 3.4 million people die in excruciating pain every year. We should be able to solve that problem across this industry and work with the NGO sector, working with governments. And I think that's something that we could lead with and deliver within the next 4 to 5 years. Solve that problem. And yes, personalized medicines, absolutely right, takes the boundaries of what we understand about cancer and other diseases forward. But there are whole swathes of our generation who do not have access to the basic drugs that can make a difference to them today.
So innovations in distribution systems as well there. Dr. Lechleiter.
Let me answer your question at 2 levels. First of all, I think that within our laboratories, there's never been a more exciting or promising time for innovation. I believe the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to start to see the real tangible benefits of this explosion in knowledge that we've achieved in the last 20 years as we've decoded the human genome, et cetera. So I think from a basic science perspective, we should be optimistic as long as we preserve the ecosystem in which innovation can operate. And I want to go back to the second point and just say we need innovation in health systems to do the sorts of things that Kerry describes. To do that, we need partnerships. And that means we need some entities within civil society, institutions in civil society working with the private sector in ways that might have been not thought of in the past or even looked down upon in the past. We need to build more trust and to overcome whatever barriers have kept us from working together, because innovation happens at that cross-exchange when we partner.
Thank you, sir. Nigel Darby, a final thought?
So I think we've touched several times on the importance of our understanding of molecular medicine, the way in which that's leading through to diagnostics, better treatment selection, better patient selection in clinical trials. I think the other things that I would point out, as I mentioned, the revolution in healthcare IT, when it comes, will be quite significant for us going forward in terms of better understanding our patient populations, but also ensuring that people achieve appropriate care. Then, coming back to that issue that we've talked about several times, which is really healthcare perhaps in the developing world, and Carrie's point, I think there are a lot of new technologies that are coming through, particularly in manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, that will start to allow us to be able to set up manufacturing technology in countries that hitherto have not been able to manufacture sophisticated drugs and vaccines. So I know certainly within our business a lot of effort going into ensuring that we can make countries become self-sustainable in manufacturing of critical medicines. And I think that's one of the things that will really help bridge this access gap going forward.
Lou Valdez, what's your perspective on this?
I think for FDA, but for regulatory authorities more broadly, innovation is really essential for good regulatory practice. It will enable us as regulators to do our job much more effectively, but also be able to use the data that's there and the data that we need. And we collectively hold a significant amount of data, but how can we begin to work much more cohesively and collectively to bring to bear and to promote good regulatory practices, strong regulatory systems, and bring in a number of kind of innovation and partnership, as we spoke earlier. So it's not just the traditional partners, but we really need to look at partnership much more broadly so that we can tackle the problems and challenges collectively. And that includes patient groups, but really kind of that leadership and partnership globally that we need to think through much more differently and distinctly.
A more unified approach, yeah. And Professor David Khayat, final thought.
I would say two things. One is, when I started to do oncology about 35 years ago, we had only palliative treatments, and most of our patients were dying very rapidly after the onset of the disease with a lot of pain. Today, more than 65% of cancer patients in our countries, at least, are going to be cured. And for the vast majority of those who cannot claim for cure, they are going to survive years and years with usually everyday better quality of life. And this is because of innovation that had occurred. Now, I wouldn't continue to do that job if I was not sure that for the upcoming of better days in the future. I'm sure that with personalized medicine and everything, we will continue to raise the number of patients that are going to be cured. Now, I think two questions or two issues that we have to really handle appropriately is one, is the best way to cure a disease is not having the disease, so prevention. I think there's not enough work that is being done on prevention. And most of these NCD are diseases that can be prevented and would cost much less for our nations to try to prevent them instead of making the diagnosis and treat them and lose these patients. And the threat, the thing that frightened me sometimes for the future is going to be the access to these treatments. We start seeing in our countries, in England, start to be in France and many other countries in Europe and elsewhere in the world, that the governments or the agencies or whatever are starting to set up rules to try to limit the free access to the expensive new innovative drugs. And I would like to be really sure that everybody in the future that would need these drugs, really need, and I agree about the responsible use of drugs, but who really need the drug would be able to access to that drug. Right. And that's going to be, to my point of view, the main issue for the next 10 years.
Professor, thank you. Please, a round of applause for our panelists there.